But on guitars, I believe there's enormous room for improvement all round, whether it be a classical guitar or a steel string acoustic guitar or a jazz guitar or a ukulele or whatever.
I'm pleased to have Murray Kuun as our special guest on this week's episode of Life with Strings Attached. Born in 1952 and educated in the Josie area of South Africa, Murray's journey has led him through various professions. Following compulsory military service, he ventured into banking before finding his passion in map drafting for nearly a decade. And despite this, his heart gravitated towards design, music, and woodworking, where his passion culminated in the establishment of Designs Unlimited, where he crafted unique contemporary furniture predominantly centered around music and television themes. Murray Kuun says that a transformative trip to Italy in the 1990s, punctuated by a visit to Michelangelo's David and a serendipitous encounter with a luthier, is what ignited his desire to craft musical instruments. With only a poorly written book as his guidance, he painstakingly fashioned his first violin, marking the beginning of a prolific journey into instrument making. Over the years, he's honed his craft, making countless traditional violins before transitioning to original designs that more reflect his love for music and innovation. Today, Murray Kuun's portfolio boasts of hundreds of one-of-a-kind guitars, violins, mandolins, ukuleles, lutes, and even a cello. While prioritizing sound quality, Kuun devotes considerable attention to aesthetics and ergonomics, ensuring that each instrument is as unique as its player. At Guitar Design Lab, he aspires to be the intersection of tradition and the 21st century, creating art-infused instruments tailored for like-minded musicians. Murray believes that bespoke one-of-a-kind instruments are quite likely to spark inspiration and musical creativity. I enjoyed my conversation with Murray Kuun. I hope that you do too. Hello, Murray. Welcome to Life with Strings Attached. Thank you for being here.
Hello, Jamie. Pleasure.
Yeah, and how are you today?
I'm very well.
Yeah, great.
And you?
I'm doing wonderful. Yeah.
What
Things are
kind of
good.
weather do you have? Do you have good weather?
Well, I think it's good weather because I'm Canadian. So it's a little bit cool. Last week we were up between 30 and 35 degrees centigrade, which is very warm for a Canadian.
It is. That's our summer, but we're in the middle of winter now.
Yes.
And today is quite nice. It's about 20.
See, I like that kind of weather, and that's where we're about today. Also, around between 20 and 22 degrees is quite comfortable.
That's where we are.
Yeah. So wonderful. And you're in South Africa, is that correct?
Johannesburg, yes.
In Johannesburg proper. Okay. You're actually in the city of Johannesburg?
No. I'm in the suburbs, about 20 kilometers away.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I've never been there yet, but I hope to in the not so distant future.
You must come on safari.
Oh, I'd love to do that. Of course, that's what we're all supposed to do when we get there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, wonderful.
I do it a few times a year.
You do? Okay. And what does going on safari actually mean?
Well, we don't use that terminology. That's sort of more an American or North American thing. We just say we're going to the bush.
Going to
our
the
happy
bush.
place. The bush.
Okay. And does that mean camping? Does that mean going to a cottage? What does that look like?
It would be a cottage, yeah, cottage or a lodge or something.
Okay, and what do you do when you're there?
We eat and we drink, and we go and look for animals.
Okay.
Spend a lot of time in the car looking for animals.
And what do you expect to see when you're out there? What's normal to see versus what's rare to see?
It depends on where you're going. Not all the bush lodges have the big five. The place that we go to quite often, called Pilanesberg, they have the big five, but you don't often see all of the big five. You've got to drive around quite a lot, and you'd be very lucky to see the big five. But you'd normally see two or three of the big five.
And it's a safe thing to do. Do you have to be trained to do it? Do you go with
No, no,
guides
no,
or tour
no,
yourself
no. You
around?
only have to be trained to stay in your car.
Yes. Okay.
And just last week, a Spanish tourist, although he was told to stay in the car, decided to get out the car, and an elephant killed him.
Oh wow.
And so you've got to respect these guys. We're in their area.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. That's remarkable. So we have a place. I'm from the Toronto area in Canada, and we have a place called African Line Safari where we get in our cars and we drive through. And they tell you, of course, yes, stay in the cars. And I remember as a young child going through these areas, and it was when I was young, it was very normal to have chrome and rubber trim on the outside of a car, and the baboons and such. They love shiny things, and so they would rip all this stuff off the car, the antennas and such.
So is that like
You didn't want to take your nice car through there.
is that like a zoo?
It's more
Where
or
you
less a
go?
zoo.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a zoo, but the animals are out in a safari, if you or on the
Mm.
range, if you will, and you drive on the road slowly. And yeah, I
I
mean, you
haven't
see
been
the
to Toronto. But I've been to Vancouver.
Oh, okay,
Mm.
yeah. Well, it's a beautiful place, but quite different than the
I,
Toronto
I
area.
was there. I was there, and it was -18, so it was pretty chilly.
Yes. Well, they do have good skiing in the area, so you can be happy at -18 if you're there to ski.
Well, I wouldn't be able to ski. We did
Yeah.
tubing. I think they call it tubing. You go
Oh,
down the
yes.
mountainside on a tube. We
Yeah,
did
yeah.
that. We couldn't do it for more than about half an hour before we froze.
Right. Well, those places often have hot tubs also, and a hot tub at -18 is a lovely place to be.
I'm sure.
In the jacuzzi.
Just the
Yeah.
transition might be a bit tricky.
It can be. It can be. At Whistler, they have a swim out pools. The pools are warm on the inside, and you swim under the glass, and you can transition from the pool right over the edge into a hot tub. And so, they make it
Okay.
easy for you. So
All
it's a
right.
nice place to be. So,
The
anyways,
friend that I had in Vancouver's now moved to Kelowna,
hmm
but I
yeah.
haven't been there.
Oh, that's into the mountains at that point in time. That's also a nice spot. Yeah, that whole province is a beautiful place. Yeah. So, well, wonderful. Well, Murray, thank you for agreeing to talk today. I think we've only ever spoken maybe once before. I think we had a Zoom call a number of years ago, so we don't know each other very well. Not as well as I know
It
many of the
could be.
guitar makers in the world.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, yeah. So it's quite some time ago, and the main reason that I haven't been to visit you in person actually, because that's often what I do, is because you're far away from much of the guitar
15,000 miles.
industry and the community. There's not the shows that are happening there and such. And so I'm really interested to know a bit about that for you. Is how you got involved in guitar making in the first place, because you're in a space that's quite far removed. I also, we work with the only guitar maker in Iceland and one of a couple in New Zealand also. And there's a few spots in the world where there are people making quite remarkable guitars, but
Yes.
they don't have a lot of friends and peers around them that they can learn from and share with. They're more
Yeah, no,
isolated. So
I'm self-taught. My background is musical passion, or a passion
mhm,
for music, and
mhm,
passion for music and a passion for design. And I, I, I'd sort of considered thinking about making an instrument, particularly a violin, because
mhm,
violin is my first passion.
mhm,
And I didn't think it was possible, so I didn't even pursue the idea.
mm,
And then I met a little Italian luthier working in Florence. I had just
mhm,
spent 2 or 3 hours staring at Michelangelo's David, and I was quite
mhm,
inspired. And with my few words of Italian and his no English, we decided that I should at least try to make one. So when we got back here, this is in the 1990s.
Okay.
I had, when I got back here, I looked for a book. Amazon, I think it started. There wasn't much in the way of internet. I got a book, not a very good book, a very lousy book, actually. It was Roneoed. Do you know what a Roneo is? Those sort of old-fashioned machines they used to use in schools.
Like the spiral binding on the end of it, like a coil or spring?
Yeah, it goes round and round. Anyway,
Yes.
it was a book written by an old guy, and it wasn't very well written, but I spent time with it, and my first violin took me a year.
Okay. And was it a traditional violin, like something in the tradition of the Cremona tradition, the Cremonese tradition? Yep.
Exactly. I then, probably by that stage, I'd got one or two more books and spent more time. I made a few dozen violins in the end. But one of my driving forces is design. And I'm not a journeyman. I can't just make the violin over and over. That drove me nuts. I needed to know how to make it, but once I knew how to create the sound and get the correct geometry, I started designing my own violin. And I'd made a few, but it wasn't well received by the violin people. The violin people wear blinkers, and well, in fact, all classically trained musicians, I think, wear blinkers, and they can only see what they see. And that's when I started thinking about guitars. So I thought I would do a classical guitar first, because the music I listen to most often is classical type music, Baroque actually. And I made 2 or 3 classical guitars, and then I branched out and went into making an archtop. Archtop is closest to violin making in terms of carving the plates and so on. And I rather enjoyed that. So most of the guitars I make are archtops, but I don't only make archtops. I've made over 100 flat top type instruments as well. I make violins, mandolins, ukuleles. I've made one harp guitar, and I've made one lute. So once I've made a lute, I can probably be called a luthier, but up until that stage, I'm not a luthier. I'm a guitar maker. So
I agree.
I concentrate on making guitars.
And so those, you learned the traditional Cremonese style of violin making, and then you made some classical guitars. And were those, did you stay with a Torres inspired classical guitar, or did you also make some variances within it like you did the violin?
From the very first one, I made it quite drastically different. I had designed and made a violin which I called Norma Jean, still active today. Beautiful shape to me, to my eyes. And my first classical guitar was a Norma Jean.
Okay. What does that
it,
mean?
Norma Jean is the real name of Marilyn Monroe.
Oh, I mean, I understand that, but what does that mean as far as your design is concerned? How can you identify your classical guitar and your violin?
No, it was just a shapely shape.
The silhouette.
I'm very inspired by proportion, shape, curved lines. It was sometimes straight lines as well, but mainly shapes.
Yes. And so that's what you did with your classical instruments as well.
Well, that's what I did on the first 2 or 3. I made one, and I got a few orders, and they sounded great. They just didn't look traditional. And so since then, my classical guitars are more or less the classical shape, except I've changed the proportion to be less dumpy and slightly more elegant. But I don't make many classical guitars. Probably do more arch tops than anything. I'm quite into jazz.
Okay, great. And so, where does this passion for design come from? Are you educated in that area, or is it a personal passion that you trained yourself?
No, it's personal, and I don't know where it must come from. Distant ancestors, because my dad was an accountant, and he couldn't put together an electrical plug.
Right.
And he had absolutely no art, and he didn't really appreciate art, but he was a pianist, and he was a damn good pianist. And he could sing and he could dance. He had rhythm. But I think maybe on my mother's side there might have been some more art. So I started designing things at about 5 or 6 years old, I remember. And at school, it was my best subject, woodwork and drawing. And my first job was, in fact, drawing maps. I drew maps for nearly 10 years.
Oh, great. Were you an official cartographer? Is that not the name for map drawing?
Well, I did something slightly different. I did contour drawing, which is topographical stuff.
Okay, yes.
So companies would commission a topographical study of a certain area before they built a road, for example. So I did that sort of stuff for nearly 10 years. But in the meantime, I had been building furniture as a sort of as a hobby. My wife's father was very keen on woodwork, and him helping me, I made a few pieces, a bed and a table and a couple of... the first thing was a hi-fi stand for the music.
Yeah.
And
when might that have been?
1970, in the early 70s.
Yeah, there was a serious studio furniture movement happening at that point. There was lots of people exploring that space, weren't there? Were you connected to them in any way, or?
No. It was only at that stage when I started getting international design magazines. I built, and I was just keen on it, but I didn't know there was a movement. But I'm aware of those, the Bauhaus and all that sort of stuff nowadays. But my first pieces were just functional. I needed a stand to put my hi-fi equipment on, and then we needed a bed to sleep on, and so on. And in fairly short space of time, I got into furniture making full-time. And the business I had, we designed and made very high-end, very modern pieces. And that went on for nearly 40 years. The furniture business and the musical instrument business overlapped by quite a bit. In the last 10 years, I've made no furniture, and I have designed no furniture. Since the advent of China, it was very difficult to sell furniture in this country. Everybody was just buying from China.
Yeah.
So my passion for music and my passion for design paid off, and I threw the two together in a melting pot, and that's what I do.
Yeah. It's a common theme amongst people making musical instruments. Many of them come out of cabinet making, furniture making, design. And you sustained your living with your studio furniture business?
Beg your pardon? Yes. It was a full-time business. That lasted for nearly 40 years, and about 10 years ago, we decided to close it down. We were struggling to sell against the Chinese prices.
Yeah.
Also, I got ill at that time, cancer, and so we decided to close that down and
Mm-hmm.
pay off all the staff. And
Yeah.
I went into the instrument business full time. At that stage, I was designing furniture in the mornings, and in the afternoon, I was making instruments.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it was half.
Yeah. Yeah. There's another wonderful guitar maker in Chicago who actually has a very successful furniture company called Troscan, him and his wife. And his name is Robert Robinson. And he makes wonderful guitars also. I think you'd probably appreciate them if you took a look at them. But
Robinson.
yeah, Robert Robinson. Yeah.
I'll
He's
have
been
a
a
look.
part of the Boutique Guitar
Yeah.
Showcase. And he does very interesting work also. And actually the interview we did earlier this week was with Ned Steinberger, who is most well
Yes, I
known for
know.
the headless guitar and
I
such.
don't know
And
him, but I know his products pretty well.
yeah. And Ned also came up through cabinet making and studio furniture, and eventually into guitars. And so
Well,
it's a theme that keeps coming up.
old man Stradivari also started as a learner cabinet maker, I believe.
Oh, I didn't know that, because
He
Christian
learned.
Martin, of course, did, and he was not allowed to make guitars in Germany because of the guild system, because he was trained as a cabinet maker, and so it was illegal for him to make guitars, which is
Oh,
the reason he moved to New York, because they didn't have a guild system there. So it didn't matter if you could make a guitar; you weren't allowed to make a guitar because you weren't part of the Instrument Makers Guild. You were cabinet makers, and that maybe wasn't a problem in Italy at the time. Or well, there wasn't in Italy at the time. There was
well,
a bunch of small fiefdoms at the time, but yes.
would have been in 1660 or 1670, somewhere around there. I don't think that he stayed in the furniture business very long. I think he just trained with his uncle,
I see.
and then he went into the violin making business.
Yes.
And he made violins for about 80 years, I think.
Okay. I have yet to go to Cremona, but we spend a lot of time in Italy, and I keep getting invited to go to Cremona, and I'll be there soon enough, I think.
I've been to Cremona many times. It's my favorite little spot in the world. Well, I'm a big fan of Tuscany, but Cremona is not far removed from Tuscany.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
I used to go to Italy at least twice a year, once for the big furniture fairs in Milano.
Yes.
And then end of September, beginning of October, they have a big violin fair in Cremona. So I've been to that a few times.
Okay.
I haven't been in the last 10 years or more.
Well, that's the one that keeps inviting me to come, is the fair in Cremona, and
you have to go to it. It's just
we'll
incredible.
get there.
Well, anybody half interested in instruments, mainly violins. I mean, my musical passion is J.S. Bach and the Beatles. So maybe that spans quite a big divide.
Sure. Right. So Murray, let's when we can talk about this Italy and Tuscan thing a little bit more later on. Actually, I don't think anyone knows this on our podcast yet, but we're in the midst of setting up our European office, and it is in Tuscany. And so as of September, we'll start filming our Life with Strings Attached, coming live from Tuscany at that point in time.
Which part of Tuscany?
Split our years between Florence and Pisa. So
okay, all right. Yeah. We go to a place called Greve. It's in Chianti region.
Okay.
It's about 45 minutes drive from Florence.
Yes, in the south, right? I believe at that point.
Southwest.
Southwest. Yeah. So we're kind of due west. We're towards Lucca, if you know the area. But, nonetheless,
I know that area,
we enjoy our time there as well. But I haven't actually played one of your instruments. I've only seen your instruments. That's one of the things about you being far away from the rest of the community is, but of course, it's the aesthetics of your instruments that you're best known for. And so, can you maybe share with us a little bit of your design philosophy, what it is that drives you? Because there is a certain look to your instruments. How did you arrive there? How do you think about design?
Probably just evolved. When I decide on making a new instrument, my first priority is the sound, the type of sound that I want to make.
Mm-hmm.
And once I've decided that if I'm going to say make a jazz guitar, I would decide, look, I want to go for a modern jazz instrument rather than the very fat, mushy sound of some of the older jazz guitars. I then decide how I'm going to make the guitar. And once I've decided on the basic construction method of that particular guitar, I would then work around aesthetics that I like. I don't know if you've seen my newest guitar called Meraki, a jazz guitar.
Yeah, is this the one with a dark top that's quite chevroned, the way you've
that's
it?
the one. Yeah. And that look was inspired by one of my favorite companies making loudspeakers is based in Italy. They're called Sonus Faber. And they in an area up towards northwest.
Okay, that's a German name.
And
Are they? Yeah, and then you're Trieste, perhaps in the section between Italy and Germany.
No, it's somewhere between on the road from, if you go from Milan to Venice, it's on that road. Yeah.
Yep.
So it's the little town's called Arcugnano. It's near Vicenza.
Okay. Well, I'm a big Amorone fan. That's wine country for me.
They make beautiful loudspeakers, and I saw a photograph of one of the loudspeakers that had that chevron type design. I call it herringbone, but chevron's closer. And so that's how that was inspired. We don't, you spoke about Pella and wood sustainability, and I've got that fairly dear to my heart. And I try to use fairly ordinary wood and maybe use it in a different way. So on that particular instrument, the chevron makes a huge difference to the way the instrument looks. It also alters the sound, but it's fairly ordinary sapele mahogany. So it's not some exotic endangered wood. It's fairly ordinary wood. Sapele is an African wood, comes from somewhere in Central Africa.
Yes. Yeah. And that's those strong lines are interesting to work with, aren't they? I've most commonly seen them just oriented in a vertical fashion, but I like the way that you've chosen to. I don't remember. Did you herringbone? So if we herringbone them, then we'll put the contrasting grains slightly offset from each other. Is that what you did?
Yeah, it's not quite that. It's probably closer to your word chevron.
Oh, chevron. I
just call it herringbone. Herringbone has a slight offset, and you usually use it around the edge of a guitar. Yes. I've done that once or twice. And on that particular instrument, it's got a fairly flat carve on the top, which gives it a particular type of sound. And I wasn't quite sure how the herringbone was going to affect the tone. I sort of had an idea, and I compensated on the back of the instrument, which was a much softer wood. It's called obeche, and it's sort of almost spruce-ish. So the body and back of the instrument are the soft wood, and the top is the harder wood. So I quite like the idea of playing around. I don't always believe the way that we were taught is always the right way. There must be more ways to skin a cat. As far as violin making is concerned, there's not very much that can be done to improve the sound of a violin. The violin sound is just about perfect.
Well, perfect for
I'm
what?
talking about a good violin. The ergonomics are bloody terrible, but the sound
Yeah.
is great. But
Mm-hmm.
on guitars, I believe there's enormous room for improvement all round, whether it be a classical guitar or a steel string acoustic guitar or a jazz guitar or a ukulele or whatever. There's a couple of guys who are working towards that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a maker in Australia called Greg Smallman.
Mm-hmm.
He makes the John Williams classical guitars, and he started experimenting with different ways to do the soundboard of a classical guitar.
Yes,
So
the
he's
double
trying.
top and lattice brace. Mm-hmm.
No, he's not. He doesn't do the double top, but he does a top that's less than a millimeter thick
Mm-hmm.
with a lattice brace, and the lattice is a sandwich of balsa wood and carbon fiber.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't necessarily love the sound, but I like his thinking. His
Mm-hmm.
son was a classical player, and he was an engineer of sorts,
Mm-hmm.
and he decided to approach it from a different point of view completely. And
Mm-hmm.
his guitars like his get used all over the world nowadays in concert halls because they project so well, and um, the double top guitars is another story. It does something similar, but the top is incredibly thin, cedar,
Yes.
about a millimeter thick.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, what I'm saying is that more makers should experiment with making in different ways. One of the silly little things that I learned in one of the books when I was making my first flat top steel string guitar was that the nut of the guitar should be bone. Well,
Mm-hmm.
people just take it for gospel, but they've never tried anything else.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that violins and cellos have had ebony nuts forever
Mm-hmm.
didn't come into it. So I like the idea of folks trying different things. The guitar's got a lot of potential.
I agree. And well, there's a lot of places we can go with this part of the conversation,
Mm,
but from my perspective, the reason that well, actually, I find it very interesting that you say that the violin has been more or less perfected and sounds very good because, of course, it does sound very good, and we enjoy the sound of it. But what we're typically referencing when we say something sounds good or not good is a context. And the
of course.
context is the body of work which has been developed. And there's so much body of work around the established violin that's what we mean is that it sounds good when we play songs from the canon, essentially.
Mm,
And each guitar style also develops its own canon. When people judge a jazz guitar, they will play songs from the jazz book, from the canon, and they will
yeah.
judge your guitar by whether or not it does that thing, and at a certain point in time, we've explored almost as much as we think we can explore within a particular movement, and all the innovation leaves it because we refined it and refined it and refined it because we say now this is the sound, and that's what you express with the violin. But when you go to the guitar, you don't say this is the sound. You think there's a lot of room still to explore, but there's lots of people who would argue with you that, Leo did it best the first and that you don't need anything but a Telecaster, or that,
Yeah.
all you need
Mm,
is a Martin OM or a D18 if you're a bluegrasser, because that's the sound of bluegrass in that
yeah.
scenario. And so, the thing that's been so remarkable about the guitar is that because it continues to evolve, it continues to have exploration of new music, and that new thing that doesn't sound right, because typically the new guitar is not accepted by the current generation because
Correct.
it doesn't make the sounds of the canon.
Mm,
And we have people come to the boutique guitar showcase and they'll look at a guitar and they'll say, well, who's going to play that? They're not trying to be insulting. They mean they cannot conjure up an image in their mind of
Yeah,
the look and the sound, there's no reference for it. So they literally
it's a,
don't know what to do with it. But
it's
the
a very
musical
staid
explorer
and
will look at
traditional. It's quite a traditional. Guitarists are just as traditional as violinists, in my experience.
well, many of them are,
Hmm.
but there's still lots of room for exploration there, and you have to know where to
Absolutely,
look for those
and
people.
that's why I say, laterally, there's so much that can be done in any genre. If you're talking about a steel string guitar, most flat top steel string guitars, new, sound
Hmm.
terrible to me. Not terrible, but
Hmm.
I don't like the mix of wood, air, and steel strings.
Hmm.
They're too bright. So I work towards a slightly more mellow sounding guitar, as a
Hmm.
guitar would be that Martin made 80 years ago. And
You don't think those
I think
Martins sounded just as bright when they were new?
I reckon they did. Yeah.
Mhm.
I've done a I'm not much of a restorer, but when I first started making violins, I used to buy old violins and do a little bit of restoration, open them
Mhm.
up, see how they worked, and the how wood changes in 70 or 80 years is incredible.
Mhm.
It's when I'm working on the inside of an old violin that's that old, it doesn't feel like the wood that you and I know. It feels completely different. It feels closer to cardboard.
Mhm.
Um, so that's probably why those old instruments, or many of them, sound so much nicer to my ears anyway.
Mhm. Mhm. Did you to many? I know plenty of modern players though that expect a different sound out of it, and so there's something that's interesting happening as technology evolves because the majority of the music we hear is not live music. We're hearing recorded music, and
Yes,
so the historical examples are very strongly filtered by the limitations of the technology at the time.
yes,
So when we're hearing somebody recorded in, let's say, 1950 or even 1970, the recording equipment very strongly influenced the listener's experience at that point in
absolutely.
time.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so as we have developed our hi-fi audio, as we've expanded our technology, as we've been able to make full and clear bass, as we have crisp trebles, the listener experience has changed, and the expectations of people who are now playing have a different idea as to what the guitar will be. Because I noticed that people from an older generation, when they pick up an acoustic guitar, they kind of want to hear the sounds of I don't know who, a Crosby, Stills and Nash, or a Bob Dylan, or the Beatles, or something of the sort. But when you hear that Beatles, like, when they're playing like Blackbird or something, that's not what that guitar sounded like. That's what that guitar sounded like with that microphone and recording technology
Correct.
now.
Yeah,
And so it
yeah.
has a bit of a flatter, warmer sound to it. It's not at all what it sounded like when in the studio
For
or
sure.
what the
For
musicians
sure.
were playing. And so I think, let me sort of resolve that for a point. I find that, um, well, let's clarify. There's two types of players on the extreme: those who are looking to reenact, that's a sort of classical impulse, the golden
Mhm.
age, golden years impulse. And then there's musical explorers who are looking to push the limits and do things that haven't yet to be done yet on the extremes. Most people are somewhere in the middle.
Yeah,
Those musical explorers who are looking to get everything they possibly can out of the guitar, they actually want bright, crisp trebles. They don't want a guitar that is more mellow, because they can make it mellow by the way they play it. They can play it with their fingers as opposed to a pick or a plectrum in some way. They can play
yeah.
it closer to
I
the
think
neck as opposed to
uh,
closer to the bridge. But if you don't have that high end response, you can't make it happen. You can't make that old guitar sound bright or hi-fi.
it's just um, my personal preference
Hmm.
is a balance um, of wood and
Hmm.
air and the steel strings. Now,
Hmm.
sometimes when I listen to a recording, again, recording depending on who recorded it,
Hmm.
I hear far too much brightness. But as you say, some players, that's what they want.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or maybe your
My
stereo maybe your listening device is much better than everyone else's too.
Well, I've been a so-called audiophile for nearly 50 years.
Yeah.
Um, so I have over 3,000 CDs,
Mm-hmm.
and I had a big record collection. I sold that. I sold it about 2 or 3 years ago, and
Mm-hmm.
I've just started again back to LPs because I
Mm-hmm.
think the sound is a little bit closer to what I
Mm-hmm.
like to hear compared to
Mm-hmm.
a CD. I
Mm-hmm.
haven't got into streaming or anything like that yet.
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com. So let's go back to this wood, air, and string for a second.
Yeah.
So how do you consider those 3 points, and then how do you manipulate them for your own instruments and the voicing? Tell me more about this wood, air, and strings part.
Well, if um, if we simplify the explanation, I think a lot of steel string guitars are
Mm-hmm.
over-engineered.
Mm-hmm.
When I hear guitars made by the top makers that you and I both know, Michael Greenfields and so on, I
Mm-hmm.
don't hear that excessive brightness that I hear in a music store when they're playing, I don't know, a Taylor or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And they over-engineer them. I think one of the main reasons is that they have a warranty. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the first things I learned, expressions I learned when I started making a steel string guitar, was that a good steel string guitar is an implosion waiting to happen. In other words, it had to be quite lightly built, and that's
Mm-hmm.
sort of what I do. It's lightly built by comparison.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so the voicing of it, when you talk about the wood and the air, let's take one at a time. So, commonly people talk about amongst acoustic guitar makers, they say, trebles are free. You're using steel strings, so the trebles just are there. Actually, to make them less bright and to make them a little more round is the typical terminology, is the challenge. But you just get that high end off the treble strings, is how many people communicate that. What do you think the influence of the string is on the guitar? How do you describe it?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. Obviously, you get different strings, different quality strings, but overall, the string is quite bright. But it's only bright if you put it on an instrument that is over engineered. So the top might be too thick compared to the bracing. It's you can't really say the bracing must be X design or X size based on the thickness of the top, because you've got to be holding that piece of wood in your hands. So if I'm using a spruce top, for example,
Mm-hmm.
I'm peeling it as I'm making it. I do some very basic technical tests. I do a test to see how much deflection there is and so on like that. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a technical maker. I work more from experience or an artistic background. I, I
Mm-hmm.
I I know of all those Chladni, or sometimes they pronounce it differently, Chladni patterns that
Yes,
these
yes.
guys do.
Mm-hmm.
I set up for that. I bought equipment, a sound generator, and all sorts of things 25 years ago. And I did that, and I don't think that's the way. It's not the way that I would like to make instruments. I want to make instruments that um, are more artistic, not in the way of looks, but the maker needs to be able to feel what he's doing with the wood.
Mm-hmm.
You know, two pieces of spruce that might have cost the same and look the same would sound quite different. And you'd only know that when you're handling it. And it's not even a conscious thought, oh, I need to do this to the bracing. It's just something that happens as you're bracing it. I decided years ago, that the ordinary X brace is far too bright. So I changed that to parallel bracing, and I've changed it now to a modified X bracing, so that the X is far shallower, so that I have more movement on the sides of the plate. Taylor have done something quite nice there in that regard. They've done something that they call the V class bracing.
That's right. Yeah.
And I rather like what they've done. They've done something around the edge of the guitar, which I don't agree with, but the actual bracing pattern is quite nice because it gives some freedom on the side of the plates for vibration.
Yeah. You're talking about the small routing on the outside edge that you don't agree with? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. They sometimes they put a groove around the outside, and I learned that in my violin making days, which I still teach violin making. I have a small school and I have a few guys, and I've just completed a violin with a student. When I say a student, he's a retired plastic surgeon. He's just about nearly 80. And I read almost every book that I could lay my hands on that was about violin making. So the earliest book was, I think, Tim Heron, I think was his name. And the first publication was somewhere around just after around 1900. And if you read in between the lines and read the lines, read in between the lines, a lot of those books, and one of them said something that was quite important to me. And a lot of makers would thin down the edge of the plates, and that I agree with, but they go too thin. And then the vibration or the resonance in the top is lost. It won't go into the sides and back, depending on what design you're using. Some guitars don't use the back. Those double top guitars you spoke about, classical guitar, their back is quite dead, and sometimes they're carved into an arch as well, so that they more project rather than be alive. I prefer my instruments to be alive. When I'm holding an instrument, I want to feel the whole thing alive.
Yeah. Of course, when you're feeling it all against yourself, you're also influencing the sound at that point in time.
Of course you are.
Yeah.
You've got to learn to hold it so that you're only holding maybe the point of the guitar against your chest. But what I'm saying is you want to feel the instrument being alive. And if it's overbuilt, or if the top is too thin around the edges, I think you lose that.
You can. Okay. And what about your ideas of the air? Can you explain that to me? How do you consider that?
Well, it's if you get the balance of the construction of the woodwork right, the amount of air, if you get that balance right of the size of the instrument compared to the woodwork, and whatever string you use, you could end up with a particular type of sound. And I work towards a particular type of sound which is slightly less bright. I do like clear, crisp trebles, but I don't want to just hear steel. And that's what I often hear. I just hear steel, and I don't hear wood, and I don't hear the air.
Yeah. Okay.
But having said that refers more than anything to a flat top steel string guitar. And I'm doing less of those at the moment, although I make a slim line, which I'm quite partial to, and it's a little bit more than half the depth of a normal instrument. I like it because it's comfortable, and it can to amplify it is a little bit easier than amplifying a full depth instrument. But my main area at the moment is probably with regards to archtop guitars, and I nine cases out of 10 I don't make acoustic arch. They are acoustic, but the acoustic is very small. On that new Meraki archtop, I've got an incredible small acoustic space. The instrument is very, very shallow. But if you listen on the YouTube clip of that, there is a bit of it playing unplugged. And the unplugged sound is very sweet. It's not what you would hear if you were playing a solid-bodied instrument, that's got very little acoustic. So I think it's just trying to get the balance right of that amount of acoustic space that, when amplified in the situation of, say, a jazz band, the instrument can, the players use the terminology, cut through the mix a little bit better. That doesn't mean it's got to be horrible and bright, but it's just not quite as fat sounding. It can be made fat sounding by amplifier settings, and you can turn the treble back on the body of the instrument. You can turn that back, so you can get a fatter type sound. But that's not the type of the sound I'm trying to get to in my archtops. Is really a very clear, clean, but not bright sound. Maybe that's not even the right word. Bright. It's got to be fairly bright, but not brash.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So it's, I keep pushing back into this sort of wood, air, and strings, but I've been on an exploration myself to try and encourage a common lexicon, common language around these terms, because I speak with, as you know, many guitar makers around the world, and there is not a common set of terms that are being used, and there's definitely not a common agreement of each guitar maker disagrees with the next guitar maker on what these sort of terms are.
It's very difficult to describe sound. I've read many audio magazines, and there was one called The Absolute Sound. I don't know if you ever got to see that magazine. They're still going, The Absolute Sound. And to them, going back to audio, that's the absolute sound is a sound of an unamplified instrument, acoustic instrument in acoustic space. And they had the most fantastic writers. Harry Pearson has since passed away, but they had, and even those guys, they never had the terminology to describe sound is incredibly difficult, as you say.
But yet, physicists will describe sound. Acousticians can describe sound. And so, actually about 1 year ago, myself and an architect from New York, Ed Keller, put together a symposium at the Venice Biennale where we could bring together multiple disciplines to discuss sound as one of the things, the materiality of sound. And so I've been on a bit of an exploration to discuss this with as many different disciplines as possible to find the common language, and then decide perhaps which terms we can apply across the musical instrument. And so some of my earlier interviews, actually with Zachary Bellinger on Life with Strings Attached, is an acoustician and physicist. That if you haven't listened to that, you might enjoy listening to that one, because he's not a musical instrument maker at all. I also just Bellinger. Zachary Bellinger. I think he's episode number 4 or something. You can go to our YouTube page, and you can see all the podcasts, and you'll see Zachary
Yeah.
Bellinger. But I also discuss physics with the aerospace engineer of Lamborghini, because they're, everything is simply, motion, time, and perception, whether we're talking about acoustics or, thermal distributions, for an aerospace engineer. It all breaks down to the same basic elements. But each person has to deal with it in a different way. An acoustician who works in architecture a lot of the stuff is band-aids for them. An architect designs a space and doesn't pay a lot of attention to the acoustics until there's a big problem with it. People get into the space and it's incredibly reverberous, and then they call in an acoustician to deal with it. And dealing with it typically means, treatments of materials, what they call acoustic materials. And you yourself even used a moment ago the reference of the magazine to an acoustic instrument in an acoustic space. Well, every space is an acoustic space. But what we mean by that is a place that's been optimized for what we like in acoustics.
Yes, yeah.
Right. And so, this idea of the wood and the air and the string for me is all correct. They're all part of a system. And we can use each one of those elements to shape things, but try to get a very, very high level view of them and not get caught up in what you referred to earlier on as the blinkering of sort of the norm. Some of those things are correct, but some of them are just, it's become common sense to people because it's the normal way of thinking, but actually we're quite wrong on them. If you have many people's description of how sound works and you take that to a physicist, they'll say, that doesn't hold water, So
I just advocate makers and listeners to experiment. It's not life and death. I do need to put food on the table at the end of the day, so I do have to make a little bit of what people like, but it's not a life and death. I think stringed instruments have got tremendous potential that hasn't been achieved yet. One of the things was the advent of carbon fiber. I don't personally like the sound that much, but I think it's got some potential, and I think I'm too long in the tooth to get down that avenue now. But I think some of the youngsters could still get there.
Are you serious about the business of guitar? Then you need to join us on Patreon. We're building a future where guitar makers are able to live prosperous lives making instruments that inspire the musical experience, which helps to create a more beautiful world, where others who are passionate about the guitar can thrive. Those who help in the promotion and resale, trade shows, writing of books and articles are supported as a valuable part of the community. A community where we explore with curiosity and encourage those around us in their endeavors. With a community effort, we can accomplish far more than we can individually. So let's be serious about your guitar business and join us on Patreon at patreon.com/business of guitar. That's patreon.com/business of guitar. So when you say it has a lot more potential, what do you, you must have some sort of hypothesis as to what you think that could look like. What do you mean it has more potential?
Just from a pure musical point of view, it's difficult to explain because it's not a technical description. It's more an oral description of what. And I can only talk from my own personal point of view. I can't say to Joe Soap, his guitars must sound like X. That's certainly not. But I'd like them to experiment to see what else can be done with a guitar. For example, the guys from True Temperament. You know,
I'm familiar with them. I do, yes.
Yeah. And because when I was making my first and only lute, I started getting into the whole thing of intonation. And, when you make an electric guitar and a youngster tells you, but there's no adjustment for the intonation, I have to then tell him that no fretted instrument on earth can ever intonate at every intersection of the string and fret. It's just not possible. And so these guys, the True Temperament, have tried to work around that problem, and they've come up with something. I don't think they've solved the whole problem, but if you run through your fretboard string by string by fret by intersection, you'll find that theirs is more accurate within, if you say, if it's been optimized for, say, a 10 gauge or 11 gauge or whatever.
Right.
I've used their products 2 or 3 times when clients have specifically specified it. What I like about it is that they've tried to overcome the problem of intonation. Whether they've achieved it fully, only time will tell.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's it's an interesting system. And so you had to, I presume, send your fretboards then to Sweden, and they did it themselves. They installed the frets for you.
I give them the guitar specifications, scale length, and they make up the complete fretboard. I tell them what material I want, and it arrives from overseas, ready-made up.
Okay, so you didn't have to send them the material; they had the material and shipped it to you.
If I said I wanted an ebony fretboard and it's a 650 millimeter scale length, and I've told them the size of my nut and my string spacing at the bridge, they make it accordingly. And my spacing is pretty much standard, unless the client has asked for something different, and their standards would fit in. So I think I've used it 3 times. Every time with the client specifying that they want that particular product. It's very expensive for us. Our exchange rate is nearly 20 to the US dollar. It's actually 18 something. So it's very expensive for us to use it, but if that's what a client wants and they're happy to pay for it.
Right.
They will have been sold on the idea of the True Temperament, and I quite like the idea. I just like more the idea that they're doing something about it.
Yes, I think. Yeah, I agree. I like the fact that we're not just accepting the limitations, but that we can challenge them and we can try and make improvements. I agree. Yeah. And for our listeners who are not familiar, the True Temperament fret is not a straight line. So if you imagine a fret that looks a little bit squiggly, to be honest, that's what a True Temperament fret looks like. And so it's been optimized for each string based on your string gauge. And as Murray said, you can look them up. Swedish company, I believe, near Stockholm. Yeah.
They're Scandinavian. I can't remember if they're Swedish or Danish. The Swedish, I think it's
Swedes, I believe. Because Ola Strandberg uses them sometimes, and I think they're actually close enough that they're close by. And I've been to Strandberg in the Stockholm region also. And so, anyways, so people will know what we're talking about. And then temperament is different than just straight intonation.
When people see them for the first time, they flabbergasted.
Yes.
One of the downsides is that fretboard is incredibly heavy because they make the fret, they sort of a jumbo-sized fret, but they use a huge steel rod that's machined. Well, it's CNC machined, and it's not like a normal fret which has just got a tang and a rounded part on the top. It's a very heavy piece of equipment. They might have changed by now. I haven't used it in about 3 years since I used it. The other interesting thing was the advent of the fan frets. So with the varying scale length on one guitar, and that was also somebody doing something about trying to change the guitar. Whether I think that I've made fan fret instruments, and I don't know that they've got all the advantages that they're meant to have. But the fact is that somebody's done something and said, how can we improve the scale length on the bass, on the low E compared to the high E is quite different. And that's supposed to give you a sweeter treble versus a slightly more powerful bass, but still keep the whole range in balance.
It's supposed to actually give you an even response, not
Yes,
necessarily more powerful. It's supposed to be even. I mean, the oldest instruments are all multi-scale instruments. You know, piano's a multi-scale instrument. A harp is a multi-scale instrument. Even a violin, even though we don't adjust the nut and the saddle, but the fact that it doesn't have frets, there are fewer notes on the low string than there are on the high string. It's just
yes,
basic Pythagorean theorem, you know, at
yes.
this point in time. And so I wrote an article on this multi-scale that's on the boutiqueguitarshowcase.com that people can read if they'd like to. I'm a pretty firm believer that actually a parallel fret will eventually disappear. I don't think it can stay on the guitar. It was a crude solution that worked for a while, but we know it's not right. There is an actual improvement with the multi-scale as far as the evenness, the tension of the strings, the clarity, but also the intonation of the instruments.
The idea is that the intonation would improve with
Yeah,
multi-scale.
yeah, it will. And so it's just so much functionally better. It's not indifferent. It is actually functionally better that I think that as time goes by, that the parallel fret will eventually just sort of disappear, you know, like something like friction tuners have in the past. You know, we don't use friction tuners anymore because a geared machine head is simply just much better.
I just used a set today. I'm setting up a new design violin that I've made, and I was just setting up my tuners, and I'd fitted some new strings that I bought off a Chinese website for about 40 Rand. That's less than 40 cents for a set
Okay.
of violin strings. And
Wow.
I thought I'd like to just try them just for interest sake. And they're
Mm-hmm.
enormously powerful. I've never heard of, and I've made this violin with that same chevron design top with a
Mm-hmm.
softer
Mm-hmm.
back, and
Mm-hmm.
enormously powerful. But I've got to get a proper violinist in before we can make assumptions. But yes, I was working with the friction tuners today, and they're really
Mm-hmm.
painful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we stick to it with the violin and such. And, you know, there may be some sonic benefits, possibly. But the guitar, it's long gone off the guitar. No one is trying to make a guitar with friction tuners.
Well, I did one. I've made a 19th century type guitar,
Mm-hmm.
and the original makers was La Pravotte,
Hmm.
and he was evidently a violin maker. So he had made this guitar much like I would,
Mm-hmm.
because I learned on violin making, and
Mm-hmm.
he had used friction tuners, and I tried to, and it still has friction tuners, but I never tried to play the instrument. It's a pain.
Right. Exactly.
You do get new tuners now that look exactly the same that are geared.
Yes.
Wittner makes some, and there's a guy I get mine from a guy in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's called Precision or something. I can't remember the name of his business.
Yeah.
And
So somebody's
they're pretty
patent
damn good.
them.
Beg your
Yeah.
pardon?
Somebody's patent them. So you can't, they've eliminated the possibility for competition, unfortunately, which I'm a big believer in open sourcing and competition because
Yes.
he'll never get it to market in the same way. And I'm going to get myself in trouble here. But the point is, if you want this to take on, you should allow competition, frankly. And you should compete and make a better version than your competition.
Absolutely.
But
These,
by
these,
putting a patent and enforcing it on something that you can't make widely available at a reasonable price, you're just killing your own market.
well, the whole business of patent is I don't really understand it, because when I first started designing furniture, I thought I needed to patent certain furniture designs, and it turns out you actually can't. You can register a design,
Yeah.
but it doesn't the guy just changes the sizes slightly, and then he's overcome the problem. So I don't really understand the patent. 40 years ago, I thought I would patent some furniture designs that I did, but I
Mhm.
decided I just need to stay ahead of the pack.
Exactly.
As far as, yeah,
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. And so I've actually tried to chart out guitar evolution. And one of the major things that I've found is that there's no evolution happening off of one of the major branches of guitar. And I think it's mainly because the primary company based around that sues anybody who comes close to them. And so as a result, there's all sorts of design evolution happening off of everything but their designs. And I don't
yeah,
think that's good for their own future. So
yeah.
anyways.
Well, there's a number of ways of looking at that. The whole When I came to the musical instrument business, I was absolutely flabbergasted to see the amount of copying that goes on.
Mm-hmm.
Blatant people just they call it a Telecaster.
Mm-hmm.
To me, a Telecaster was only made by Fender, and they should be the one that made the Telecaster. People just say, "Oh, I made a Telly," or "I made a Strat," or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's like in the Toyota boardroom one day, someone walked in and says, I think we should make a Renault." You know,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't happen in other industries so much, but
But does in
copying is not
ours? I
the
mean, you
thing.
talked about the violin and about the Torres guitar. I mean, every classical guitar looks the same. Everything, every violin in the world, almost, with very few exceptions, yours and Ned Steinberger's among them,
Yes,
look like what a Stradivari, an Amari, whatever you want to call it, the Cremonese
yeah,
style of violin,
yeah,
and we don't call that copying. As a matter of fact, I know
yeah.
successful violin makers in Northern Europe who have to they sell their brand with an Italian sounding name so they can get better prices, even though they're Dutch.
Mm.
Because we're
And
so stuck on that.
well, they've gone so far with copying violins now that I've seen these violin makers um, with a photograph of the original one that they're
Hmm.
copying, and they make each little scratch identical. So they're
Yes.
sitting there with their fingernails and little tools and making scratches. I
Hmm.
absolutely hate that idea.
Right.
This whole relicking thing just drives me. I think I'd have sleepless nights about that relicking.
But you can learn that in a university in Italy because they
Mm.
need people to do that in museums
Yeah,
to make copies of pieces that they
that's
don't put on
fine. But
display.
when old Mr. Antonio Stradivari made his instruments, he made them new, and he could try to get them to look as good as possible, not drag them behind a truck to make them look a bit older. But that's me. It's personally, I'm as I said earlier, I'm long in the tooth, so I've got some pretty set ideas about things like that.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
Having said that, although I'm old-fashioned in some ways, my designs, I think, are pretty much contemporary, and
Hmm.
I like it when people do that. You know,
Yeah.
architects. I'm a huge follower of all the architects in history. And my
Hmm.
favorite architect is a lady who just died 2 or 3 years ago, Zaha Hadid. Do you know her?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful work. Hmm.
You know, beautiful, beautiful buildings. You know, with
Hmm.
flowing lines, and I just like to see stuff like that.
Hmm.
And I
Agree.
try to do that in my instrument designs.
Right. And I enjoy architecture in the same way with people who are pushing the limits. So last year when we were on tour, we have to drive from the Netherlands into Sweden. We don't have a stop in Denmark, but we do actually have time in Denmark. And so you might be familiar with the Bjarke Ingels group, and they have something called Copenhill in Copenhagen. Do you know about the
No,
Copenhill?
no.
So so they have not a recycling plant. They have an energy plant which burns garbage, which produces a very clean emissions. So they filter it heavily, but they
Yes.
power about 100,000 homes from this power plant where they burn their garbage and turn it into usable clean energy.
What was it
This
called?
it's
Copenhagen.
called Copenhill, like Copenhagen,
Yeah.
but Copenhill.
Yeah.
And it's in the city. Like you can see it as you drive around Copenhagen. And it's this large building. It's a bit of a wedge and then another wedge coming down. But they've put a bar in at the top and they've put a silicon ski hill on top of the garbage energy plant. And so you can ski down the hill all times of year.
I've seen that ski hill. Yes.
So that's what we're talking about. That's Copenhill.
Yeah.
And on the outside, there's a rock climbing wall. And there's hiking trails up it.
Yeah.
And so now we've taken the architecture and something that was normally ugly industrial purposes, and we've turned it into a useful structure that we actually want in our cities. And there's tour buses come into it all day long. Normally, we don't want to go near those areas, and they've turned it into an attraction. I think it's remarkable. I love that sort of thinking.
Yeah. So my thought process is really, as I said earlier, I like to design the sound in my head first, based on the experience that I have. I may not be. I haven't been in it for 50 years, but I've been in it for long enough, and I know music well enough to know more or less what I want, and then I try to make the product more interesting, visually and ergonomically. I don't believe I always achieve what I'm after. If I did, I'd be probably much richer than I am.
Yeah.
But in some cases, a musician, any given musician, would be able to increase or improve his maybe his playing or his composition if he's inspired by the instrument. And that's what I try to do. So, somebody who buys one of my instruments would normally buy it because of the way it looks, stroke, the way it sounds. I can't compete with the big steel string makers by name. They've been doing it for many more years. No one's going to buy one of my flat top steel string guitars when they can afford to get one from one of the big name makers. What I can do is try to make it look a little bit interesting, as well as sound good.
Yeah. Well, great, Murray, that's a great transition point. So to all of our listeners, I think we're going to wrap up the regular part of the podcast right now. And for those of you who support us on Patreon, if you want to hear something about the business of guitar, Murray and I will continue the conversation over on our Patreon for another few minutes. Again, that's Jamie Gale Patreon, and we will talk about the business of guitar there. So let's say goodbye to the regular folks right now, Murray, and then we'll stay on and talk for another few minutes. So,
okay.
All right. Thanks for being on Life with Strings Attached. Thank you for watching and listening. You can find more episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts, and a special thanks to those who support us on Patreon. It's your support that enables us to do this work.